Hello and welcome to this Chalkbeat Ideas event about the myths and realities of higher education. I'm Matt Barnum, Chalkbeat Ideas editor, and I'm thrilled you're here. I'm really looking forward to a rich conversation. A few quick logistical notes to start. We're going to start with a brief presentation by me on the data about higher education. Then we're going to have a discussion with our panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience. You can enter questions in the Q&A feature and upvote the ones you like. I'll also use some of the pre-submitted questions, and we'll do that at the end. We'll also make the recording and slides available after the event. Okay, let's jump in. The headlines of the last few years have been really hard to miss. Americans have given up on college as a path toward prosperity and have much less confidence in colleges and universities. That's the narrative. The goal is of this discussion is to figure out to what extent that's warranted and why, if it is, what specifically has happened and why it's happening. So, first of all, it's genuinely true that Americans have lost confidence in colleges and universities. Here's one set of polling numbers, but others show the same things. Fewer people trust US colleges and universities. Why? The typical explanation is some combination of soaring tuition, poor return on investment, high student loans, and college campuses that are closed-minded or overly liberal. Let's look at the data behind some of these potential explanations. So, one of the most common concerns about college is that the price is just out of control, and that it's been going up dramatically. What's actually surprising is that for the last 2 decades, real college tuition has been flat or even declining. Now, keep in mind, this is not the sticker price. This is not the amount that if you look up a college, their tuition that it will show. But this is what people will actually pay after discounts. There's a big distinction between the sticker price and the real price, but the real price has been basically flat or dipping. Now, people may still be concerned about the price. You can still see the private four-year college price is pretty high and would stretch most families' budgets. But at least over the last couple decades, it's not been getting worse. So it's hard to believe that explains the change in perception about higher ed. How about the value of a degree? Well, the basic economics have not changed that much. This shows how much college educated workers make versus those without a degree or with just a high school diploma. There is a big edge for college educated workers, which economists refer to as the college wage premium. Now, that hasn't grown that much in recent years, but it remains very high, in fact, at historically high levels. Keep in mind, this only counts folks who actually earn a degree, which is not everyone who starts. We will return to that point later. Now, you may have heard that there's going to be, or that there already are, a lot of really highly paid jobs out there that don't require a degree. There's not much evidence that's the case. As you can see from this table from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, these are the jobs that have projected to have the most new openings. The jobs that don't require a college degree are typically low wage ones, especially home health aides. There's another wrinkle to this of, okay, we know that people with a college degree make more money, but is it really college? Is that really because of college? Maybe people who are already going to succeed are more likely to go to college. Well, there have been studies on this, and here's a kind of wonky graphic of one. It looks at students who just made the SAT cutoff to get into a public university in Texas versus those who just missed the cutoff. And it looks at their earnings over time. These groups of students are otherwise identical. You can see at first the person who does get into college or the group of the students who do get into college make less money, probably because they're in school. But later, the college students start to make more money, quite a lot more. Other studies have found similar effects. And that's not dependent on graduating. That's the typical effect. That said, not everyone benefits. We can't say that 100% of people benefit from going to college. We're talking about averages. This chart is from a report that estimates the return on investment of a university education. I would not take the methods of this study as gospel, but it's an attempt to consider the cost and benefits. You can see in the lower left-hand corner that an estimated three-quarters of the time pursuing a bachelor's degree is worth it, but not always. The biggest predictor of a positive return is graduating, and the biggest predictor of a negative return is not graduating. This chart is takes a second to wrap your head around, but it's very important. In the darker blue, it shows the share of student loan borrowers who default on their student loan debt based on how much debt they hold. This is older data because more recent information, to my knowledge, isn't available. But it shows something interesting and surprising. Your risk of defaulting is higher if you have lower amounts of debt. Pause to process that for a moment. Higher chances of defaulting with lower debt, which is the opposite of what you might expect. How could this be? This likely reflects that many people carrying low debt did not graduate and did not go to expensive schools, but aren't earning a good wage, so they're struggling to pay off their debt. It's this group that we should perhaps be most concerned about. Oftentimes, the news articles focus on people with very high amounts of debt, but those are often graduate or professional degrees and people who make good livings so they can pay off their debt. Next, I want to look at the question of whether the very simple question, seemingly, of whether fewer people are going to college than used to. This is very widely cited data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it shows that there was a sharp decline in enrollment between 2020 and 2023 of college enrollment. That was true overall and of men and women, but especially men. Yet, when you disaggregate this data, it shows something interesting. Almost all of the decline is at two-year colleges. The distinction has often been missed about people who describe a broad-based decline in interest in college. Why has there been a decline in two-year enrollment? The likely explanation is a combination of economic trends and COVID disruptions. When the economy is doing better, two-year college enrollment tends to fall. You can also see a few schools that have seen the biggest declines in enrollment between 2010 and 2023. There are a lot of two-year schools, and the four-year schools are large for-profit universities. The key point is that the schools with the big declines are not the ones that we've seen in the headlines, or I suspect that are driving the negative view about American higher education. Now there's a little more recent data beyond 2023, and in the last few years, we've seen a notable uptick in university enrollment. Now it's basically back at pre-pandemic levels across sectors. This is all university enrollment, but undergraduate only enrollment looks similar. This may reflect economic trends as unemployment rates have risen, and that may drive interest in attending university or two-year college, especially. Here's a look specifically on highly selective institutions broken down by the neighborhood income of the students attending them. As you can see, these elite schools, though they have gotten a lot of negative headlines, they're not struggling to fill their classes, it doesn't seem. They see enrollment continue to go up and up. But it's also still just a small slice of society. The vast majority of students at those schools come from high income neighborhoods. Let's briefly turn to the future of higher education. With birth rates declining, it's pretty reasonable to expect enrollment to go down. This is a look at the projected look at high school graduating class, and each year, most years, it's going to be lower than the last. So we should expect that to reflect, to impact higher education enrollment. Again, I don't think it will affect the most elite schools, but the schools that are not in the headlines. The other big question mark is the impact of artificial intelligence. Some people have suggested it will fundamentally disrupt higher education. I think that could be the case, but I don't think that's happened yet. There have been some discussions about rising unemployment among young college graduates, and some people have suggested that's because of AI. Yet we also see lower employment rates for non-college graduates, which suggests it's not an AI story. To be clear, I don't think we know what the long run effects of AI are on higher education yet, but I think it's too soon to say that AI is already fundamentally disrupting the labor market for college graduates. My takeaways. The state of higher education is perhaps not quite as dire as it seems. The typical explanations for declines in college enrollment actually don't really align well with the data because we see the apparent value hold steady, we see college tuition hold steady or even decline, and we see the elite schools that seem to have driven the negative higher education narrative. They're not the ones struggling with enrollment. They're actually still thriving in enrollment wise. In terms of the value of college, my reading of the evidence, the best evidence we have, which by necessity is looking backwards, but it suggests that college is beneficial on average. What that benefit looks like depends on the student, the school, their major, and their career goals. The future, though, is uncertain, especially with artificial intelligence and the shrinking student body. All right, I'd like to bring on our panel to discuss this and other issues. Um, Shavar Jeffries is the CEO of the KIPP Foundation, the country's largest charter network, which prioritizes giving students from low-income families the opportunity to attend college. Hi, Shavar. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you, Matt.
And we also have Zachary Bleemer, who is a Princeton University economist who studies higher education. Thanks, Zach.
My pleasure. Thanks, Matt.
Shavar, I'd like to start with you. I just love your broad reaction to the data that I shared and your thoughts generally on the narrative about the value of college and what the prevailing narrative might miss.
Yeah. Well, again, good to be where you, Matt. Good to see you, Zach. The broad kind of thrust, Matt, of what you presented is very consistent, aligned with how we see the world, how we see the facts on the ground. The data that you pointed out is precisely the data we see, that the college degree continues to open up the most pathways for the young people that we serve on every domain, from the economic outcomes you talked about to the social capital, access to the white collar economy, access to positions of leadership in our country, longer life expectancy on every domain. We serve predominantly brilliant young people of color, and we also are very familiar with research that says that students of color need more credentials to get their foot in the door, not less. And so we're very focused on college. We're college centered as an organization. We're very proud to have a history and legacy of delivering that. So our students who are 84% Pell eligible graduate from college at 3 times the rate of low-income students in this nation. And frankly, if you extrapolate our college completion rate nationwide, it would close the racial college completion gap in the United States. And so we spend a lot of time working to support and in some ways educate our families about the ongoing value of the college degree, because you rightly pointed out that there's kind of a broad societal if not consensus, but definitely a strong set of societal messages that are undercutting the value of the college degree. Obviously, it's very expensive, but as you pointed out, the net price has been flat or even declining over the last several years. We invest heavily in college counselors through something we call KIPP Forward, so we can match our young people to colleges that have quality completion rates connected to quality economic outcomes and also affordable for our young people. And it's also the case that this CT space that many are talking about now, the rhetoric dramatically outstrips the reality in terms of the quality of those programs, the extent to which those programs actually connect young people to economic opportunities that are beneficial. And so in many ways, that whole space is one that is very undeveloped and is in choate right now. And so it's quite dangerous given the facts that we do have on the college completion side and the lack of data that we have on the CT side to have this narrative that college is no longer the place that the middle class and the poor are to look to for economic opportunity.
Thanks, Shavar. Zach, can you talk a little bit about your research on the value of degree for students from low-income backgrounds and also how that's changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's worth starting by taking a step back and asking, what does higher education look like for students who are going into college or university life? And in particular, what kinds of institutions are people attending? So think about every 18-year-old in America. And let's just start by thinking, okay, like what kinds of schools does this full cohort of young Americans attend? A first thing to note is that a third of these 18-year-olds are not going to go to college. So we've got a third who aren't going to college at all, and then something like another 25% who are going to a 2-year, primarily public community college. So these are people who are outside the 4-year sector, and note that we're already at almost 60% of this entire cohort who are going either not to college or these 2-year institutions. All right, so now coming into the four-year sector and starting with the fancy private universities. I'm sitting here at Princeton University. If you take not just the Ivy League, so 8 private institutions, but take the top 50 private institutions in the United States, a pretty wide swath of institutions that I think a lot of people will be familiar with. The top 50 private institutions in the US enroll fewer than 2% of the 18-year-old cohort that's going to primarily be graduating high school in the next year. These are a tiny sliver of American higher education. 6% are going to go to their state's flagship public university. So 3 times as many kids are going to the state flagship schools, but still, we're talking about relatively few students. And if you then include all of the other research-oriented public universities, in addition to the top 50 privates, all combined, we're still at fewer than 15% of each cohort. So what are we talking about when we're talking about where do kids go to college? Well, most kids are going to either less selective private or public universities, between which are going to enroll almost 30% of young people going to college. So those are the schools we're talking about, right? Schools outside the top echelon and schools that are outside even their state's flagship institutions. And what's going on at those schools is that quality of education for the students who enroll at these less selective institutions has been deteriorating over time. So Matt just pulled up a figure that I put out with an economic historian co-author last year that is showing a different version of the same fact that Matt had up a moment ago, looking at the college wage premium in the US. So we're going to start by focusing on the black line and dots, which is data that is 100 years old. And the way to read that black line is that when you compare the average later career wages of people who went to college versus people who don't, at different parts of the parental income distribution, what you should see here is that people who go to college are earning like 10 ranks more. This is in the ranks of the wage distribution in the US than people who didn't go to college. So on average, at that time, people who went to college were at something like the 70th or 80th percentile of wages in the US, relative to people who had a high school degree but didn't go to college, who were earning about 10 ranks lower in the full wage distribution. What's interesting about that line is that it's basically flat across the parental income distribution. Whether you were poor or rich, if you went to college, you earned 10 ranks higher income. You know, this is the equivalent of many thousands of dollars compared to people who graduated high school but didn't go to college. So now compare that black line, data from 100 years ago, to the red line, people who are now in their mid-40s and who went to college about 20 years ago. And what you can see is the red line is quite upward sloped. So the way to read that slope is that people from the bottom of the parental income distribution who go to college just don't earn that much more than people who graduated high school but are at the bottom of the parental income distribution and themselves didn't go to college. Whereas at the top of the parental income distribution, going to college gives an even larger bump than it had 100 years earlier. The way to think about this is that something has changed about American higher education such that the poor, even if they make it and go to college, are getting less value from American higher education than they were in the past. And we show here in the study that this was true 100 years ago, that the line was flat. It was even true 50 years ago, basically, that the line was flat. Since the 1960s and 1970s, the value of college going for lower income kids has pretty dramatically fallen, whereas the value of college for high income kids has risen. So, okay, so what's causing or driving this? And in particular, how much of this is in the control of students and how much is controlled by institutional factors? There's really 3 main things that have changed over time that have decreased the relative value of college for lower income students. I'll come to the figure we're looking at in just a moment. Let me tell you about the other 2 big changes first. The first is a change in fields of study. So having nothing to do with institutions per se, lower income kids are studying majors that just pay less than the majors that high income kids are earning, even after they go to college. So what's actually happened here is 2 pretty interesting trends. So I think a lot of people will be familiar with the sort of so-called death of the humanities in the US, that fewer and fewer students are earning degrees in humanistic fields. That decline in humanistic degree earning has almost exclusively come from high income students. At the same time, computer science has exploded in popularity over the last 20 years, and almost all of that explosion has come from higher income students. So higher income kids are moving out of majors that pay less, the humanities, and they're moving into majors that pay more, computer science and other technical fields. And that transition of higher income kids into higher paying fields has increased the relative value of college for high income kids, while on average, low income kids are becoming more likely to go into the humanities and thus getting less value from a college degree. There are a couple of different reasons for this transition. I think the dominant one is that universities have made it more challenging to earn STEM, computer science, business, nursing, and other relatively more lucrative college majors through major restriction policies, GPA caps, and other kinds of within university stratification. But to some degree, this is also the preferences of students that are pushing them toward majors that are perhaps seen as easier or more friendly, and that have led kids to earn less value from the colleges they're enrolling at. A second high level trend has been the growth of community college, which has primarily grown among lower income students and which offers less value to those lower income students than if they had attended even a non selective local public university that leads them toward a bachelor's degree. The final story is the figure that you're looking at right here. So the way this figure works is along the x-axis, I'm lining up all American four-year colleges and universities by their average SAT scores. On the left are the low testing schools. These also tend to be the schools that lower income students tend to go to. And on the right, high testing schools that richer kids tend to enroll at. And what these lines are showing you is the amount of money that these schools are spending educating their students in three different periods, from the late 1960s until just a couple of years ago. And what you can see is that these lines are becoming steeper. So what does that mean? It means the schools that enroll higher testing and typically higher income students in the 1960s were spending about twice as much as the schools where lower income and lower testing students tended to enroll in the 1960s. But today, that multiplier has increased, to 3 or 4 times in the 90s, to four times or 5 times in the 2010s. The schools that higher income and higher testing students are enrolling at are just doing much, much more today to educate their students, to provide social and student services, to provide the kinds of quality and education that have just become decreasingly available to lower income students going to local public universities. Flagship public universities and private universities have just very substantially pulled ahead. And I want to emphasize, these aren't administrative costs, these aren't research costs, this is just instructional expenditures, the money that schools are spending to teach students. And that money has just exploded at the schools that higher income students tend to enroll at. This has been very costly for low income students, and I think I should cut myself off here, but I think one sort of interesting space to talk about here is both what can students do to try to follow the money, right? Like how can lower income students and other students find schools that are expending in a way that will allow them to get a really high quality and valuable, economically valuable education. But also, how can we think about changes to the American higher education system that would change the kind of stratification that you can see in this figure? There's no obvious reason that we have to spend more educating higher testing or higher income students. You can imagine different approaches, and indeed, I think there's lots of policies on the table that could change this.
Thanks, Zach. That's extremely interesting. I want one follow-up and then I want to get you back in, Shavar, because I'm sure you're chomping at the bit on some of this. But like, Zach, is your takeaway is not that higher education is not worth it for low income students, right? And if
Oh,
it's not your takeaway, why not?
yeah, that's a really good question. So, if you think back to the first figure I showed you a moment ago, it's not the case for anyone that, or at least on average across the parental income distribution, that going to college doesn't provide any value at all. I think for the very large majority of students who even enroll at a non-selective local community college or non-selective four-year institution, that on average, that enrollment decision is economically enhancing for the rest of their life. Now, if they don't earn a degree, that value is lower. If they end up in a lower value major, that value is lower, et cetera. But on average, the value of college remains very high, even for students who are getting less value from college for the variety of reasons that I just mentioned.
Shavar, I'd love your thoughts on this and how, if you had any further comments on what Zach just presented, but also how KIPP thinks about getting students into schools that they're very likely to benefit from that are good environments for them.
Yeah, I think, our experience confirms what Zach found. And so we invest heavily in college counseling and matching. And so generally speaking, in our country, you may have one college counselor for, 300, in most urban schools, 370, sometimes 400 students. And so we have one counselor for 90 juniors and 70 seniors. We focus very intensely in this area. We work with our students, we work with our families first to frankly, even starting as early as kindergarten, to begin to cultivate the mindset around the value of college, because our communities have also internalized these messages. And we should be clear, this isn't a new conversation. And so for many generations, there have been conversations about who is college material, who should have access to this pathway, who should not. K-12 has organized itself around these assumptions in a variety of different ways. In a lot of ways, at KIPP, we're here to disrupt that. We're here to, one, recognize the brilliance of our young people and that they are more than qualified for the most rigorous pathways with college as a minimum. And so, in addition to kind of building this mindset, in our young people, and of course, building their skill set so that they are highly qualified for these opportunities. We then spend extensive time, particularly as the kids get into high school, on this type of one-on-one individualized counseling. We have conversations with our students on every domain. The college completion rate, the estimated college completion rates for schools, the net cost to our families of attending these schools, the extent to which these schools have persistent support. So Zach talked about the differentiation we see, where a variety of schools have a range of services for first generation students and others to help them make it through college, whether it's mental health supports on campus, whether it's academic counseling and guidance. Some schools even have programs where they'll provide cash assistance. Sometimes a low-income student may need a couple $100s just to make it through for books or some other unexpected need. And so some schools will provide those services. We actually built partnerships with about 100 colleges, some much better than others, to be clear, where certain colleges basically agree that they're going to provide these kind of persistent supports for our young people so that they can make it through college. And so it's critical that one, in K-12, you want to make sure the students are prepared and that you then invest in the intensive college advising and counseling so we can match our students to the right colleges. And then we need reform, as Zach talked about, in higher education on multiple levels. Access. We know the data shows that the credentials of Pell eligible students actually outstrip the colleges they get admitted to. So it just further speaks to the undermatching problem. So some people may say, oh, these kids, they don't have the credentials. And that's actually objectively not true. They actually have credentials that would suggest they should be at more selective institutions. But some of these institutions, whether it's their full pay obligations, whether it's the ways in which early decision plays out, and among other factors, we don't see Pell eligible students at those schools as much as they should. And so we need reform on colleges, not only in terms of access, but in providing supports to enable young people to complete, and obviously also holding down the pace at which these costs increase year over year. Because even notwithstanding the data you talked about, Matt, in terms of some of the ways in which the net cost has gone down to some degree, it's still too high for too many of our families.
Shavar, do you see evidence that the narrative of like college isn't worth it has impacted how your families and students think about college? Or is this just sort of like an elite narrative that is in the papers that isn't actually affecting how real people make decisions?
It's definitely a factor in terms of how our families and students think about the utility and the value of a college degree. And again, this is a long-standing challenge we've had, right? So this conversation we're having now really isn't new. And so for many, many generations, particularly for the students we serve, who are oftentimes first generation, sometimes families have not seen the direct payoff. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation now about the facts about how unaffordable college looks like on its face before you get to some of the specifics in terms of looking at scholarships and Pell and other grants that are available to young people. And so we have to do a significant amount of work to show our parents, to show our students of the ongoing value of the college degree. And frankly, we do find when we show them the data, they follow the data. The parents, of course, love their children. They want the very best for their children. And frankly, sometimes we'll just use the argument that can make it very visceral is that look at the wealthiest people in this country. They're not having conversations about plumbing. They're not having conversations about construction trades. They're not having conversation about HVAC when it comes to their kids. These are people who will pay money for tutors on SAT. These are people who pay money for consultants to literally write their college applications for their students. These are people who will call people on the board if they have relationships to get their kids into these institutions. These are people, if they have enough resources, will literally write checks to these institutions. We saw the whole USC situation a few years ago. And so if the wealthiest with the most privilege aren't talking about the CT opportunities that some push on our families, then why should we not have the same sort of expectations for our young people?
For both of you, starting with Zach, I'd like to sort of think through the risks of not finishing college. And if there is a student who you could statistically say, if they go to a school based on the school that they're going to, based on their academic credentials, we think there's at least some non-trivial chance they won't get a degree. Should their advisor, should their parents advise them not to go to college? What do you think, Zach?
So I think there's a couple of different points here. The first is that I think it's worth emphasizing that the share of college goers who earn a bachelor's degree is roughly 60% in the US, and that has been true for 100 years. So it's not the case that over time, a growing share of college goers are having a hard time completing degrees. It has always been true, that a lot of people who go to college don't end up finishing. Now, what has changed in dropout rates in the US over time is that the share of rich kids who drop out has declined and the share of poor kids who drop out has risen. So, for example, if you look at dropout rates in the Ivy League in the early 20th century, right, it's like in the Harvard incoming class of 1910, there's a nice white paper by John Thielen that he literally just found the list of the 1910 Harvard class and then followed them forward to find degrees, and fewer than half of them ended up actually earning a college degree from Harvard or another institution. What's happened over time is that you've seen this just tremendous stratification where today at top private universities, there basically is no dropout, whereas at many non-selective public universities, dropout is very high. So that's point number one. Point number two is you sort of frame the question as, should we be concerned in sending students to, say, more selective or more challenging universities because they may be ill prepared and thus more likely to not end up finishing their degree? And I think this presupposes something that has just proven to not be true about American higher education, which is to say, it just isn't the case that going to a more selective or otherwise, in perception, more difficult university leads students to not earn college degrees. In fact, if anything, I think looking at universities' graduation rates is a pretty good proxy for the likelihood of any given student, even a relatively lower testing student, to earn a college degree if they go to that school. If you're choosing, for example, between USC and UCLA and Cal State Los Angeles, schools with graduation rates on the order of like 90%, 80%, and 60%, students who go to the 90% school, even relatively less prepared students, are probably going to end up being much more likely to go through and end up completing their degree, in part because of all of the student services that are provided at the schools that have very high graduation rates. It's, I think, honestly hard at many relatively higher investment private universities to not make it through and earn a college degree because they're going to do so many things to make sure that you don't drop out. The same thing is true at flagship public universities relative to relatively more non-selective regional publics. And so going to schools that have higher graduation rates, which tend to be the more selective institutions, are going to be beneficial for students of all types. Even if those students, I don't know, might be seen as ill-matched. We have now evidence of that from policies like race-based affirmative action or top percent policies or holistic review that target lower performing and otherwise disadvantaged students and pull them into higher performing or higher investment, but also more selective universities. This provides unambiguous, very substantial benefits to those lower testing students.
So, and I'll let you jump on in on this in a second, but just to follow up, Zach, because actually the premise of my question was sort of I think that's very helpful, but my premise was sort of flipped. What about the students who their only option is to go to a low graduation rate college?
Oh yeah.
Should we encourage students to go to a low graduation rate college
Yeah,
if that's their only option?
absolutely. So, right, so you showed this figure from Jack Mountjoy's work in Texas as you were giving your initial presentation. There are now studies from four different states, Texas, Georgia, Massachusetts, and a fourth that you'll have to forgive me for forgetting, that have studied kids who are just on the margin of being eligible to attend their state's public institution. So consider the state of Georgia. Georgia basically has Florida is the fourth, sorry. But Georgia has a rule where if you can't get a 2.0 in your high school GPA, the state has determined that you are ineligible to enroll at Georgia's public universities, though you can go to community college. And so there have been studies in these four states that compare kids who are just on this margin. If they're going to go to college, they're going to go to among the lowest investment and least selective universities in the state. So in the Florida context, this is a study of Florida International University, that state's least selective public institution. And you can compare these students who are barely eligible to go to the least selective school in the state to kids very similar to them who don't go to college at all. And once again, unambiguously, you see large returns to college going. Now, it might not be as large as the average return to college or as large as the value of going to a highly selective institution or going into an engineering program, even at a non-selective institution. Nevertheless, that value is still considerable, even compared to, for example, enrollment at a two-year institution or a vocational program.
Thanks, Zach. I'd love, Shavar, for you to offer any comment. And one particular question I have is like how KIPP thinks about two-year colleges. Do you see that as a good option for your students?
Generally, no. I mean, that doesn't mean in some communities there may be some quality two-year colleges because there are. So there are some two-year institutions where we follow the data and we'll see they'll lead to either four-year degrees or other credible CT pathways that deliver an economic return. But as a general matter, no. The two-year college space has really poor outcomes, really poor results, really poor completion rates. In many of the communities that we serve, you may see completion rates in the single digits. And so we do not advise our students, as a general matter, to attend those schools. And so, to the point, there's no question for students whose academic profile isn't as strong, they obviously don't have the options available to them as students who have a higher academic profile. So, we're very discriminating and very intentional about how we advise our students, what institutions are available to them, how we encourage them to operate when they land in those institutions. We have, because we are so large, we're the largest public charter school network in the nation. We have 5,000 students coming out every year. We have enough volume with some of these institutions where we can lean on them a bit to provide the type of supports that our kids need. But the bottom line is we have a green, yellow, and red sort of approach where we're very discriminating, very systematic about which institutions we advise our students to attend. And the bottom line is our experience is similar to what Zach has talked about, that even as the kind of less selective institutions where some of our students have lower GPAs may be more likely to find themselves. If even within that cohort, we find the ones with, at least on a relative basis, stronger completion rates, stronger connection to economic outcomes, more intentional in terms of persistent supports that they provide, we're able to get our kids to outcomes that, at least on a relative basis, are stronger for them in terms of it from an economic standpoint, as opposed to going right into the labor market right out of high school.
We're getting close to Q&A, so keep putting your questions in the Q&A box, and especially take a look at the questions that are already in there and upvote the ones you want me to ask our panelists. Shavar, does KIPP still have a goal of 100% college attendance for your graduates?
That's always our goal. Now, we're very far from it, to be very clear. So over the next 5-year stretch, we want to get to 75%. Before the pandemic, Mathematica did an independent study and found that our completion rates were at 39%, which is obviously very far from 75, even
So
farther
sorry,
from
sorry,
100.
Shavar. So your goal
Yeah.
is 75% completion. Okay, and what's your goal and your attendance is, do you have a separate goal for college attendance?
Yeah, our BA attendance is in the mid 50s right now, and so we have work to do there. I mean, that's still suffering from, frankly, the effects of the pandemic, and so we have a lot of work to get that number where we want it to be. Our completion rate before the pandemic was 3 times the rate for low-income students, so we're proud of that. And again, that was at 39%, pre-pandemic. So that means we have a lot of work to do. And obviously, we're very mindful that we have these norms and these goals that we strive for, and we have too many of our kids not meeting it. And so, of course, we're very mindful of what does it mean to have debt and to not have a degree. So we encourage our students to, get back into school to find within the CT space, there are some programs where kids can build a credential and get some college credits at the same time. Again, not enough of them, right? We're not naive about that space whatsoever. And so a big reason we're very focused on obviously affordability is because we want our kids to make it to and through. And then even to the extent they're not, we don't want them saddled with so much debt that it's hard for them to get back on their feet and to pursue their degree and pursue, economically remunerative opportunities in the job market.
My perception, as I said in the presentation, is that the negative narrative about higher education is driven by elite schools, which make up a tiny fraction of, as Zach explained, of actual students. And I'm wondering what you guys think, if you think that's true, and like I don't like what the implications of that are for like changing the narrative if you want to change the narrative. I mean, I guess I'd love for both of you to ruminate or comment on that. And I'll start with you, Zach, since you are at one of the the much criticized elite schools to share your thoughts.
I'm not sure I really have so much to say. There is so much attention placed on fancy private schools that really don't do any education. Right, as I mentioned earlier, the top 50 private universities in the U.S. enroll 2% of students. The Ivy League enrolls about 0.4% of each 18-year-old cohort. These are schools that are wholly irrelevant to understanding what's going on in American higher education. I think a lot of discouragement of students around higher education has very little to do with educational or economic outcomes. It instead has to do with the politics of universities and a lot of the output of universities, especially around research, that are basically irrelevant to the large majority of students. And so it's, I think what I've tried to do in my work is just try to emphasize the part of the university experience that is relevant to students, namely its education, and de-emphasize other things happening at the university that I just don't think are very relevant to students.
Shavar, did you have anything to add there?
I do not.
Let's jump into questions a little early. We've got some great ones. I'll start with one from the Q&A. What are your all's thoughts about dual enrollment options for students while they're still in high school, and how do you share this option with your parents and students? I assume that's more for Shavar.
Yeah, we know we have a number of our regions that, I mean, it's like everything else. I mean, everything is about the quality of the partner, right? The quality of the post-secondary partner. And so we do have dual enrollment programs throughout the KIPP network where we've been able to find local partners that we think are quality. So, for example, New Orleans, we have a partnership with Bard College. Where our young people can graduate not only with their high school diploma, but as much as 2 years of college credits, which is obviously a beautiful thing. So they can then get their BA with 2 years of additional work after high school, which obviously reduce the costs. Completion rates goes up, and then that then cascades to the economic returns that we talked about throughout this conversation. And so this is something that we're continuing to explore more and more is when we can find the right post-secondary partner that will provide a credential and credits that actually will be received by the post-secondary institution, because some high schools and K-12 organizations have partnerships with post-secondary institutions that a range of colleges won't then accept, right? And so we want to make sure that our kids actually get actual credits that are able to reduce the time it takes for them to obtain their BA or their BS. And so this is a promising area. Again, you have to be very discriminating as we've talked about this entire conversation, make sure that you have the right partners. But with the right partners, this is absolutely something that can bring benefits that we're absolutely working to deepen. And I know other quality K-12 organizations are working to do the same.
This next question is one pre-submitted by an audience member, which is, what are the pros and cons of designing degrees that can be completed in fewer than 3 years? And there was a recent Heckinger report story, I believe, about 3-year bachelor's degree programs. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
It's interesting. In the early 20th century, there were still There was a lot more variation across institutions in degree length than there is today. So, for example, nursing programs, for the most part, were 3-year bachelor's degrees in the early 20th century. Dentistry was an undergraduate degree that started at 3 years and eventually increased, and then it became a graduate degree. A lot of work was put in at the time to basically just ask, what is a reasonable amount of time to complete what was then seen as the core collegiate curriculum? And the 4 years became standardized because there was so much curriculum to get through that it didn't seem reasonable to complete the education in less time. That hasn't been revisited. And so I think it's sort of hard to say uh, whether it would be possible for students to complete college degrees in less time today that provide the same economic value as the 4-year college degree. I think the closest thing that we have actually is exactly what Shavar was just talking about. Many students who complete dual enrollment programs are effectively completing 3-year bachelors because they come in with a year of credits earned either while in high school or over summers. And those programs seem to be very successful for students. So I think from the perspective of a student considering college going today, this is an irrelevant question because there are no such programs. I think the only way to find out would be to try to institute some such programs and see if students can nevertheless complete the education they need.
Here's another question. Uh, they write, I have found that 2-year schools serve very well as feeder schools for local colleges and universities. I have seen these students go on to higher earnings potential job industries. Thoughts?
Generally, that is not true. So when it happens, it's a good thing, but generally it doesn't happen. Generally, it's not the case that students who attend 2-year institutions um, graduate from those institutions and then finish their BA. Some do. We need a whole lot more. The completion rates. The fact is, the vast majority of students who attend 2-year institutions do not complete within 2 years. And so now at KIPP, we're very focused on partnering with those institutions that do deliver more on the promise of what's implicit in that question, and that have shown themselves over time to have outcomes that are not where the average is. But on an average basis, that is not true.
Zach, do you have any thoughts on the research on that?
I completely agree with Shavar. So there's sort of a very difficult question nested inside this question, which is, let's say we knew for sure that here's a kid, if they go to a 4-year university, they're going to earn their degree in 4 years. Alternatively, if they go to a community college, they're going to do 2 years of community college, and then they're going to do 2 years of a 4-year university, and then they're going to earn a bachelor's. The question is, what are the benefits and costs of those two tracks? The cost benefit, sorry, so the benefit is clear. You save money because maybe you could live at home for the 2 years you're in the community college, and tuition might be lower at the community college. The trouble is that, I don't know, now you're taking courses at community college that you would have otherwise taken at the 4-year university. And we have no idea, like, is it a better idea to take introductory chemistry at your local community college or at a 4-year institution? What I really want to emphasize is while there's a sort of key piece that we don't know here, which is like we don't know if it's better to take the course in one place or another, the thought experiment that I've just described is the wrong thought experiment for the reason that Shavar just mentioned. It's just not the case that for any student, we know for sure that if they go to the community college, they're going to transfer in 2 years and earn a bachelor's degree 4 years from now. And it seems pretty clear that at almost all community colleges, if a student goes to that community college, they're going to end up being less likely to earn a bachelor's degree in 4 or 5 years than if that same student were to go directly to the 4-year institution. And so while my thought experiment, I think, is really unclear, what I think we have pretty clear evidence on is for students who are on the margin and choosing between 2-year college and 4-year college, they're going to be much more likely to end up earning a 4-year college degree and have a more successful career if they choose the 4-year school.
And Zach, you and I have spoken about a study by someone we've already mentioned, Jack Mountjoy, an economist at the University of Chicago, and he looked at the merits of 2-year college, and he found it's beneficial to attend 2-year colleges if your option is not to go to college at all. but it's harmful to attend a 2-year college in terms of bachelor's attainment and long run earnings if your alternative is a 4-year college.
Yeah, exactly. This is
Mhm.
framed now decades ago by C.C. Rouse and Tom Kane in a 1990s article as, democratization versus diversion. Right, what's great about community colleges is that they democratize higher education. They make it available to students who previously would not have enrolled in college. The trouble with community colleges is that they divert. For some students, they pull them in from no college and they're very beneficial. For other students, they divert them from the 4-year sector, and that's costly for those kids in the long run.
This is another pre-submitted audience question. They write, proponents of the signaling theory of education, one prominent proponent is an economist named Brian Kaplan, would argue that the value of a 4-year degree today is less a matter of what students learn than a matter of which character traits the degrees signal they have to employers. What is your response to that argument? I'll start with Zach. That essentially, like, this is not, it's just like you have the degree, but you're not really learning anything. Maybe there's value to a degree, but it's all sort of a charade.
Yeah. So I guess I would say two things here. The first is from the perspective of a student who is deciding whether and where to go to college and what to study in college. Whether the value of their degree comes from the human capital and learning that it constructs or from its signal value is irrelevant. Either way, the student gets paid if they get the degree and they don't get paid if they don't get the degree. And so, from the perspective of the individual, I think this theoretical question of why is it that a degree provides value is irrelevant. If you don't get the degree, you don't get the signal or you don't get the learning. Either way, you don't make the money. A second question, though, is from a sort of systemic point of view, is America over investing in higher education because it's just building super expensive signals rather than building super expensive human capital? I think there's now a pretty nice and large body of research suggesting that a tremendous amount of learning is happening in higher education, though oftentimes not the kind of learning that's easily measurable on multiple choice tests. One way to see this is go back for those who have graduated college and read your freshman essays and see how your writing changes from freshman to senior year in college. I think there's good reason to think a tremendous amount of human capital is being built. I think best estimates right now are somewhere around 20 or 25% of the value of college going is just coming from the labor market signal. That's not enough to do your best to earn a college degree learning as little as possible.
Thanks, Zach. This is a question for me because I feel like we sort of missed this point of like, and this is for you, Shavar, like, how does KIPP think about like individual student interest, like interest in their goals in this conversation? Because we've been very sort of like utilitarian focused, like, how do you earn the most money? But like, what if someone wants to be a plumber because that's what they want to do? What if someone wants to go into the military rather than to pursue a 4-year degree? Like, how do you all think about matching students with their interest?
Well, we definitely are very intentional to have conversation with students, have conversation with families about what their interests are, what their dreams are, what their hopes and what their aspirations are. And so there's no question that's an important part of the conversation. We're also oriented at the same time to frankly push, because sometimes for young people, all young people can suffer from this, but even more so oftentimes for the kids we serve who are brilliant but are from high poverty backgrounds. Oftentimes they aren't even aware of the fullness of what's possible for them. And so if you ask a kid who's never been on an airplane, what do you want to do at 16, 17, 18 years old? We shouldn't be surprised that what they think they want to do is formed by the myopia of oftentimes how the environment has been constructed, right? They live in environments that have been constructed by intergenerational poverty. They live in environments that have been constructed by intergenerational racism. And so they may not have seen the hedge fund manager. They may not have seen the venture capital investor. They may not have seen the physician or the neuroscientist, but they have that potential inside them. And so while we absolutely start with what it is that a student and a parent may have said that it is that they think they want to do, as educators, as teachers who love them, we push them beyond that. And so oftentimes we have to push people to go to college, even if they don't think they want to, connected to their interests, because frankly, oftentimes when you begin to expose young people to the range of these careers, and we're very intentional about that. So we have a whole curriculum where we expose our kids in high school to a range of careers, a range of pathways that they may not have known about. When you have conversation with students and parents, and you have dreaming conversation with them about what's possible, and what may be possible beyond what's immediately in front of them, that oftentimes leads them right to the college pathway. And so we're very intentional because some institutions will persuade themselves that they're doing right by the student because they ask them what do they want to do at 15, 16, 17, and they said, I want to be the plumber or I want to be the construction worker, and then they accede to that and then have convinced themselves they've done something great when they actually haven't done the work to ensure that these are really bona fide choices that are rooted in a broad, dynamic sense of what's possible. And so to answer your question succinctly, Matt, we start with what it is that our students and families are interested in, but we don't stop there because we want to make sure that they're not selling themselves short based upon what may have been immediately visible to them.
It also seems important, this is just my own comment on some of these skilled trades, to think about this the student when not just when they're 25 as a plumber or a construction worker,
Mhm.
but when they're 45, when they're 55, when they're 62. And the what that's going to look like from a distance, which is going to be really hard for a 17-year-old to figure out. Let me pull out one audience question, which is in particular right up Zach's research interest, which is what about the big fish in the small pond phenomenon? I believe there is a study that shows that dropout rates for STEMs are higher at selective institutions than less selective institutions.
All right, let me see if I can answer this question without getting into the weeds. Uh, Great. So here's the thought experiment we have in mind. We have a student. This student is relatively low testing. Uh, let's talk actually about the specific context of the study I think this person has in mind. This is a student who has, say, a 1300 on the SAT, and they're deciding whether they're going to go to, say, UC Santa Cruz, sort of middle of the line, somewhat selective public university, or accept an offer to go to UC Berkeley, as the state flagship institution. So they're choosing between Berkeley and Santa Cruz. Their 1300 SAT score might look a little bit more like a Santa Cruz student than a Berkeley student. And they're worried that if they go to Berkeley, this 1300 student might have a hard time breaking into STEM fields at that university because their peers are going to be relatively more prepared. They might have a harder time competing in their introductory STEM coursework. And this might make it difficult for them to both perform well and persist in STEM curriculum. So now the question is, if they choose to go to UC Santa Cruz instead, are they going to be more likely to earn a STEM degree? And the answer is no. If anything, they're going to be less likely to earn a STEM degree at UC Santa Cruz. And the primary reason for that is they're going to be less likely to earn a degree at all if they go to Santa Cruz. As I mentioned earlier, in tendency, going to more selective universities with higher graduation rates makes it more likely that individuals end up earning any college degree. And conditional on earning a college degree, if they go to the more selective school, they end up a little bit more likely to earn a degree in a STEM field. The study that's being referenced is a very is a study that was conducted prior to the end of race-based affirmative action in California in the 1990s. And it was basically a simulation study trying to ask, like, if we ended affirmative action and a bunch of students like the one I just described, relatively lower testing for a school like UC Berkeley, if those students got bumped into a less selective school because there was no affirmative action anymore and they couldn't get into the more selective university anymore, would that be beneficial to their STEM attainment? And this simulation study from the 1990s suggested that it might be beneficial to those students. This was a policy that I actually ended up following up on several years after that study was followed. That study was really just doing simulations. I just followed the students. In fact, California did ban race-based affirmative action in 1998. And so you can find the students who were going to go to UC Berkeley, but because of their relatively lower test scores and the end of race-based affirmative action, ended up going to schools like UC Santa Cruz instead. And while the simulation suggested that those students might end up more likely to earn STEM degrees, in fact, the opposite happened. In fact, they ended up earning, they were less likely to earn STEM degrees. And so, in that setting, along with many others, I think there is no reason to think that going to the more selective university makes it more difficult for students to earn even very technical degrees in STEM fields.
All right, I'm going to fit in one more question for Shavar. Th this person asks, can either of you speak to the connection between retention or grad rates and fi financial resources? It would seem to me that family income would impact retention and graduation far more than SAT scores. Shavar, can you speak to that and how KIPP tries to support low-income students through college?
I mean, that's a huge issue. There's no question for multiple reasons. And I'll come to SAT in a second, but we're very intentional in the matching work that I talked about and described throughout. Affordability is a foundation, right? I mean, our families are like the average, a little bit less, financially well off than the average, but most Americans, live check to check. And so they don't have the resources to afford, without financial aid, many of the colleges and universities in our country. And so we're very intentional on cost, on net costs, trying to minimize debt for our students to the greatest extent possible. And when we think about some of the persistent supports, we are intentional in the partnerships that we build with certain colleges to evaluate the degree to which they have small grants that are available in hardship situations to enable students to stay in school. Sometimes we have students who can't re-enroll in school because they have a few $100s on the bill, right, that they just don't have the money to pay. And so we have schools that are one more flexible, so you don't have that situation. We have some others that, if they're not as flexible, they're flexible in terms of providing some of those cash assistance. So how we support our students predominantly is on the front end and making sure we match them with institutions such that the financial barrier will be less of a impediment to their ability to complete. Now, in the SAT, we should remember the gamesmanship of the SAT, right? Because the question may presuppose that there's some strong relationship between the SAT and what it takes to complete college, and there obviously is at some threshold numbers. Um, but we also know that SAT can be gamed, right? So wealthy people, they pay for tutors, right? Princeton Review will guarantee you a couple hundred points on SAT if you got $2,000. And obviously working families do not have that. And so both in terms of the making sure we match our students to institutions that will have that they can afford and that can make it through, as well as making sure that we call out the gamesmanship of the SAT, because that's also a way in which our students are undermatched. Right. So when I talked about that data earlier, there's actually about 86,000 students who are undermatched who are Pell Grant eligible, where their credentials would suggest they should get to a more selective school. But the SAT is often used as a way, as a gatekeeper for our kids' ability to access those schools, notwithstanding the fact that the data shows that those students can complete at high levels. And so on both sides, both the affordability side and then the ways in which the SAT is used problematically by some institutions to keep Pell Grant students out, there's work we can do on both of those fronts.
I'm sorry I kept us over, but that reflected the great conversation. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Shavar. Thank you to all of you who attended. I really enjoyed it. So thanks again to everyone. Have a great rest of your
Thank
day.
you. Thank
Thank
Bye.
you,
you.
Matt. Zach, take care.